pop in here and talk about the structure of this. Gretchen, can you unmute and talk about how our see and do is structured?
On the survey itself, and let me know if I'm going in the wrong direction, Marjorie. We have a general, as Alex had put in the chat, what did your group see or do at the museum today? And that includes things like saw an Omni Theater film, went to the exhibit halls, went to the, stopped at our Explorer store gift shop, bought food. And these are all things that anybody who comes in the door could have experienced. And then if they went into the exhibit halls, then we have a more comprehensive list, but it's only populated by things that when I say we, Marjorie, myself, the other folks who sort of wrestle with the data that comes from the COVES respondents, that we know that there's active questions about. So there was the race exhibit was overhauled recently. And so there's really questions around, are people going to that? What percentage of staff are going to that, or not staff, visitors, or it's tied really explicitly to one of these theme offerings. So we use that to be able to say, these are the exhibits or programs that we've identified as being a theme content offering. And that happens through a lot of back and forth discussion. Like I'll take a first pass at our listing of what the planning committee has identified and say, this feels like comprehensive. Does this match your opinions? But it's a back and forth process. So it's both what do we feel that is offered on site that's part of that theme, or there's a standing question about that. So our collector's corner, how many people actually come in and use that resource?
And we always try and look at it also from the visitor perspective. So we can't put too many things on that list, and they have to be titles that a visitor would recognize. So it can't be, did you see this one little tiny element that might be in the corner? Because there's going to be plenty of people who will guess that they saw it and they just didn't know they saw it, and they will check yes. So we really have to be pretty rigorous with ourselves on that list. And we're happy to share specifics with anybody who wants. I'll put Gretchen or I will put our emails in the chat, and you can just email us and we can share the question structure with you, and also what the reports look like. The final thing I wanted to just talk about is the hardest part that we have found really working with our museum partners is setting goals. With KPIs, what you want to do is not just say, this is what we're paying attention to, but also we like to get people to say ahead of time, what would count as acceptable? What would be an acceptable percentage of first-time visitors when we have something that we think is designed to attract first-time visitors? And this is so stressful for our museum colleagues. And I don't want to guess why, I just know it's stressful. And so I will tell you that the two solutions we have found, actually really three solutions. The first is we'll pull comp data from a previous year and say, do you think you're going to do better or worse? And we'll try and be gentle. Okay, you think you're going to do better? Let's aim for 3% better. And we'll just aim for small percentages at the beginning. If it's a brand new question, it is okay to have the first reporting period be about reporting baseline data, because sometimes having to guess out of thin air what percentage of people are going to do a particular thing is really hard. But I will tell you, my final and perhaps most successful strategy is to ask a vice president. I find that individual contributors or managers may feel more stressed by this decision. They feel like maybe they don't have the authority to do this, or that they will get in trouble if they don't meet it. And so often I will say, is it okay if I ask your vice president? And the vice president is willing to put a stake in the ground, perhaps with more willingness to get egg on their face if we didn't hit it, than an individual contributor or manager or even a director in the museum. Sarah asked, what's our reporting period? So we report bi-weekly on safety data right now, but this data that I'm talking about here, these KPIs, we are reporting either seasonally, that is about every 3 to 4 months, or annually for the total, but we do monthly check-ins. Sorry, I had to think that one through for a second. So for our annual reports, we do monthly check-ins across the museum. And if it's possible to pull monthly data, we do. There are things beyond COVES that we don't update every month. So we're reporting at a different cadence for everything, Sarah. I know that's not a really satisfying answer, but it really depends on the kind of data. So that's the big picture. Pick a couple good things, try them out, and try and get someone.
I actually had another question for you, Marjorie, and if others have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll pop over to my Museum of Science example in a second. But at the beginning, you talked about for OER and MPS, like your really awesome level and your acceptable, and then your chaos danger level. How do you determine those ranges?
Well, I asked a vice president, first of all, because my boss, who's the vice president of people in museum culture, was willing to say, and I will say right now during COVID, it is especially hard to set goals because the world is changing so rapidly. But she said, I think that this other period, we're going to use the prior year, and we're going to allow ourselves to be 5% above or 5% below, actually just 5% below last year's average would still be acceptable to me. So anything above last year's level, less 5% or 5 NPS points. She just makes up numbers. It's okay. That's green. Yellow and red is where there's a judgment call involved, because yellow, and there's not a number that switches us from yellow to red. That's about a state of mind. Yellow, we could have a really awful month, but we know it's because something really, there was upheaval. Our parking ramp was closed and nobody could park at the museum, and people were really mad about that. It wasn't, but that would produce a really big swing in our scores very quickly. But we know the parking ramp is going to reopen. That would count as a yellow scenario. Whereas, wow, nobody likes us. Our numbers have dropped dramatically and no one can explain why. We would put that as red. We would want to indicate to our staff and to the board, something is going on and we don't have a way out of it planned. So that's the Science Museum of Minnesota's agreement on how to set our KPIs in general. The green is usually a numerical level, but yellow and red, that is a state of mind about the ability to exit that bad scenario.
An art as much as a science. As I was listening to you, even though the Museum of Science uses a different, goal setting system instead of the KPI system, this OKR system, I really see a lot of similarities between the way you think about it and the way that your things are measured. So I'm going to share a presentation with too many words in just a second, but I really wanted you all to be able to see like the full written out quote unquote OKR as it is. So when the Museum of Science's new president, Tim Ritchie, came in I guess right before the pandemic, he brought with him this objectives and key results system, which is you set an objective as the example I'm going to share is we will delight our visitors on site as measured by some amount of key results. And then those key results get rated on a scale of 0 to 1 based on like how much you've accomplished them. And it's intended to be like really quick, like, did I do it or not? You shouldn't be agonizing over 0.4 versus 0.6. So kind of to your point, Marjorie, about where's green, where's red, where's yellow, like kind of wherever it makes sense. But they're measurable, like you set them to specific, numbers or percentages or increases or something like that. So I'm just going to share a couple of examples here of previous objectives and key results that we've had at the museum. I hope you're seeing that now, my screen. Great. I always have to check. Gotta check. So this was right around when we were reopening in July 2020. This is not the only objective we had. There were a bunch of other ones, but the one that was focused on the on-site visitor experience was, delighting our visitors as they returned to the museum after our closure. And so we were sort of focusing on opening new exhibits that had been planned pre-COVID, and then really focusing on COVID safety at the same time. So the COVID safety, like that has sort of migrated out of our objectives and key results over time. But when we were initially reopening, it was like top priority. So these are the 5 key results that sort of were matched to this delighting visitors on site. These are set at a level much higher than I am, but I know that some of my team, Ryan and sometimes Liz from the Museum of Science in our research and evaluation department, can give input or suggestions about what an appropriate level might be. So the ones that are really were more connected to COVES at this time were number 3, at least 50% of visitors rating the museum as outstanding by the end of the fiscal year. So that's the overall experience rating, and that would be the highest rating on that scale, which sort of represents the not just a good visit, but a really, really good visit. Like this is better than I even expected kind of visit. And then number 4, a question that we added onto our COVE survey. So like Marjorie said, adding our own institution specific questions was a rating from 0 to 10 about whether the museum appeared up to date. So we were hoping with the opening of all of these new flashy permanent exhibits that the perception of the museum being up to date and current would sort of shift. And then finally, the COVID safety was we wanted over 90%, or sorry, at least 90% of visitors reporting that we had mostly or fully addressed their concerns. And for those of you on the, especially on the science side, this was a core, temporary core question that was added to the COVE survey that all of us shared, and a few of us are still actually tracking. So we wanted to sort of keep that, in there. I will say that when these were set, like we set them after a couple of months of initial reopening data had come in, and these are like so much higher percentages of outstanding and up to date ratings, much higher than pre-COVID we had seen before. Some museums experience this differently, but we definitely saw like a ratings bump, or maybe sort of a, I don't know if it was like a honeymoon period and people were coming back when we were getting much higher ratings than before. And so we actually ended up setting our goals like pretty high, because we didn't know, it was sort of like plucking something out of thin air, trying to imagine what the world would be like coming back right after the pandemic started. But I don't know if we're ever going to hit 50% of visitors rating our museum as outstanding in the future. But at the time we were getting there, we were close. So this is an example of an annual OKR. So the museum president, like this is the people who are responsible for these are like the president and VPs and directors. But we also set them at the division level, the department level, and the individual level, and you can sort of align your goals to what you see the institution uses. And so these OKRs, they would go and they would rate them multiple times a quarter. But you also, and it's truly so much goal setting, we also set separate ones each quarter. And so if this is the annual OKR, like the set here, the quarterly OKR that we might have seen was an increase from 43% to 45% in visitors rating the museum as outstanding, or increasing from 67 to 69% for up to date, because you want to sort of make steady progress toward that goal. So we would set the increase to be sort of a smaller thing. And so it's a little bit of echoing what you said, Marjorie, about some things that you track over a year and some things that you might track in a shorter time period or more seasonally. Again, this is like so many words, but just as an example of what these actually look like. And Beth just shared a question: are COVES data the only metric used to assess progress toward these goals? So no, but especially the ones that I'm pointing out that really are basically just referencing a question on the COVE survey, that would be the primary piece of data that we use for that. Although, if I can skip ahead, I put a bunch in here. Oh yeah, so lately, the way we've been talking about it is generating an enthusiastic visitor response to new content for 2 particular initiatives. So we have a vaccine kind of initiative with a bunch of exhibit and some programs and some school presentations and like a website that all relate to this vaccine related, Project Vaccine exhibit, and then new climate change initiatives, which involve many different areas of the museum. So what does enthusiastic visitor response mean? There's a bunch of different data points that go into that, some of which are COVES data, some of which are other aspects. So this is how we've started looking at it, but we'll begin adding more measurements, a lot from research and evaluation. So maybe like exhibit specific evaluations or program specific evaluations, as well as COVES. But that trying to sort of broaden that a little bit instead of tying it just directly to like one COVES survey question. So those are my examples of OKRs. I will say that as a system, like kind of trying to learn and understand it at the Museum of Science, it's still an ongoing process. I feel like a lot of people are still, because it's not just something that's set at the highest level, it's something that every single person in the museum is expected to sort of set. And we put them in this gigantic spreadsheet that you can just go look at everyone's if you want to. So they're very transparent and very, very visible. And discussed often by our leadership and by people throughout the museum, which is the intention of OKRs. So that's like all the examples I have to share. Marjorie, thank you so much for sharing your philosophy on this. Oh, Sarah asks, how are you reporting on all these things? Alex, do you share a dashboard or send a report? Yeah, so I sort of helped make a OKR specific little dashboard page that Liz from Research and Evaluation here can go look at and track, date by date, sort of track specific COVES questions. But a lot of the reporting is in that spreadsheet. Like you go and look and you update your OKRs in the spreadsheet, and then museum leaders like the president or maybe a division leader or department leader will sort of update teams as the year progresses on how we're doing with respect to those goals. So the president will often address them on biweekly town hall, like museum-wide online town halls we have, and that's kind of the main way that they get reported, just repeatedly in meetings, in presentations throughout the year.
And in relation to how COVES data is being used to help answer or assess where you are on some of these goals, is that something that that your museum president is coming to you all saying, okay, I need information about these 7 things, or are you just automatically sending out, here's the information from last month? What does that reporting process look like? Because that looked like a lot of tables of a lot of goals potentially for you to be helping share about.
Oh yeah, well, what I didn't put in here is the column next to each goal is the name of a person or 2 people who are sort of responsible, at least for keeping track of the goal. Not that it's like no one person is responsible for creating an enthusiastic visitor response, but like the director of learning and research might be responsible for deciding kind of what goes into that and sort of setting departmental and divisional goals that lead up to that, and then putting the actual number into the spreadsheet. So it is essentially the president saying, hey, I need these things, but it's distributed down. It's a department or a division leader saying, hey, I need these 5 things. I need you to update the percentage on this so I can report back to the president so he can give feedback on our goals. Gretchen, sorry, you can follow up more with that, sir, if you want. Is there? Okay. Gretchen asked, what does it look like to tie changes to meet goals, OKRs over time? Tying what decisions were made based on the data and how that played out. Oh man, decisions made based on the data. Yeah, you might need to give me like a second to think about it and kind of roll with all of these OKRs to try to think of an example here. I can give you sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
While you think about it, examples like the thing that's really interesting from an outsider to hearing these, between what it sounds like Museum of Science in Boston is doing and Science Museum in Minnesota is like based on the way the conversation happens, or sort of whether a conversation happens around the data. It sounded, Marjorie, and you can tell me if I captured this wrong, but it sounded like the reporting and sharing and sort of discussing what does this mean happens in conversation among team members or within the vice president's group. And Alex, tracking with the Museum of Science sounds like it's let's make sure the numbers are updated at a particular level. And so how the COVES, the internal COVES team is connected to understanding how it might be influencing how staff are showing up on the floor, or what we're doing to shift exhibits or whatever, you may or may not be in the room based on those two structures.
And
Yeah.
I can share actually a bad example that I think went poorly, because that's always fun for people to hear. So if you think about the example I shared of at least 90% of visitors reporting that the museum mostly or fully addressed their COVID-19 safety concerns, that's important, right? That's really important. And when people were first returning, those numbers were really high because our capacity was so limited, and you know, the people coming back were just really happy to be back, and it was the whole thing. But right around February 2021, so we closed again for that first, you know, December wave. We had 2 closures, and then so we had a second reopening. So that coincided just about with our school vacation week. One of our school vacation weeks in Massachusetts, we have one in February, one in April, and those traditionally, obviously, are very high visitation times for us. And you know, I can't remember exactly how capacity limits had changed at the time, but I think they were higher than in July 2020. You know, even though we're reopening again, like everybody got a little bit more, you know, loosened up a little bit more on restrictions. So we actually saw a pretty big drop in that visitors reporting that they felt we had addressed their concerns and that they were feeling safe. It was like, actually, I can't remember off the top of my head what it was, but it was like, you know, a 10% or 15% drop, I think, on the order of that. And I saw that, and my team saw it, you know, research and evaluation saw it, and was like, wow, that's a big drop. So I happened to be in a leadership group at the time, and I sort of alluded to the fact that there had been a drop, and then like shared it with a lot of different people, with the president and with the head of our learning research division, and we presented it at some different division meetings. But unfortunately, one of the main effects that had was it kind of really demoralized the on the floor exhibit operations staff who were out there like every day cleaning, you know, staying after hours to clean and wipe down every exhibit, whether or not that was necessary, like to basically feel like what they were doing was not helping visitors stay safe, or that we were implying that like they were not doing enough. If I could go back in time and do it again, I would still share it. I would still alert people to the fact that there was a drop, but it would be, you know, I would probably try to present it directly to that group of people with a lot more support, like to the exhibit operation staff with more support from, you know, their direct supervisor. And so we could like brainstorm together about what might be happening, instead of sort of seeing it for the first time in a museum-wide town hall or a division meeting and feel like they were, you know, being called out for, when that was not at all what we were intending to do. In fact, we knew that they were basically stretched to their limit. And so it was like, what can we do? How can we, is there anything we can do with this data? Like, what is it about messaging? Is it about, you know, do we need different signage around the exhibit halls to set people's expectations differently? But you know, that wasn't how it played out. So I do, you know, again, if I could go back in time, I would absolutely do that differently.
And I think, Alex, this relates to something I think all of us who work in data in whatever way wrestle with a great deal, which is how do we keep reminding everybody that the data is not here as a gotcha. The data is not here to prove who's doing their job right and who's doing their job wrong, whatever that job may be. The data is how we hear from the visitors. And aren't we lucky that we get to hear from visitors, but sometimes we don't hear what we want. And so that is a long time and a long process to just continue to think about the data as not belonging to Alex or to Gretchen or to me or to any of the people on the call, but as belonging to the visitors, particularly around COVES, whoever's voice is being represented in the data. And we're lucky to get it. We understand it's filtered through the people who run the survey, right? I absolutely shape the data that we get by what questions I ask and what ways that it's presented, but it is the visitor voice. And we want to just always go back to that again. How does it help us to take care of the visitors if that's what we're doing with COVES? And how do we use it in a way that's in partnership? And that requires every particularly senior leader in the museum to never use it as a gotcha. even if they're really mad that visitors are not having a great experience, they have to use it in a way that's about how can we solve this? Aren't we lucky we heard from visitors? How can we solve this? And we're partners in doing that. And that takes a while to build. Beth asked, how often do you share the data museum wide versus just with leadership? So I can speak for the Science Museum. Again, we're sharing different data with different people all the time. The annual KPIs, which we call our scorecard. We don't use the term KPI or OKR. We just call it our scorecard because apparently we don't like using conventional labels. That goes out monthly to the whole museum. And it goes monthly as well to the board. And the theme reports that Gretchen and I were both alluding to, this sort of seasonal, the museum is going to focus on a particular topic and we're going to talk about it a lot. That goes first to the team that is really running that project and then out to the whole museum afterwards, including leadership. The other thing that we do at SMM that is maybe a little different than what many other folks are doing is that we actually have 2 COVES logins. We have one that gets all the data, and then we pay for a second COVES login, which has a slightly more restricted view of what you can do that everyone in the museum has access to. And that was a decision that we made that was important to us. We have a lot of language at the beginning that probably a lot of people skip over about, pay attention to your sample size and don't overinterpret and check with, Gretchen and Marjorie and everybody if you think you've discovered something really cool. And whether or not it's used, I feel like it's a really important gesture towards data openness across the museum, which is really important to me.
And for those who don't know, what Marjorie's talking about with logins is basically logins to the COVES dashboard. Some of you have dashboards so far. Some of you may not have dashboards yet because you're pretty early on in collecting data. So once you receive that, just know that there are options for different levels of access or different levels of control that people can have to explore the data on their own. But often it really depends on your museum size and all sorts of other things. Like you can spread it wide or you can keep it closer. It really just depends on your institutional culture and how you want to work it out. It's different for everyone. And as I keep talking here, I'll just say that if anyone else has questions or examples of how you have used COVES data in strategic planning efforts or setting long-term goals, either and you want to share, of course, raise your hand or just put them in the chat and we can go to you, because I love hearing about examples that I maybe didn't know about or just innovative new ways of doing this. So I'll kind of address your question, Beth, but sharing the data museum wide versus just with leadership. I mean, so one thing I'll say that we're really trying to, or really work in progress at the museum is a regular cadence for sort of reporting on something consistently. Which the OKR process has helped with a lot, because you have, okay, I have to report on the OKRs, but the reporting often looks like, feeding the data up to, one level up from, either me to my manager or my manager to their manager, or up to the president. And sort of there's too many OKRs here to really thoughtfully reflect on all of them in the format that they usually come out in, which is our town halls or emails that go out museum wide. So usually, honestly, at this point, it's kind of reported as, here's what it was. That's pretty good, or that's better than we expected, or something like that. And thank you so much, Marjorie, for sharing. Marjorie has to go, but if anyone has follow-up questions, I'll make sure that they are connected. Thanks, Marjorie. All right. Sorry, that was about all I had to say about sharing museum-wide versus just with leadership. Is it's pretty multifaceted. Were you about to say something, Sarah? Sorry.
I was just going to re-ask the question, of how have COVES data shown up or started being a part of the conversation, either around goal setting within your institutions in any way. What does it look like for you all? And not at all yet. This was really interesting, could also be a helpful conversation.
I can hop in and give a little case study. So we are just now like getting used to having this data regularly. So there's been a lot of questions about kind of what should we be going for, what's normal, what's expected. So it's been really helpful to have like this as our own baseline for the past about year. But it's also a little bit like crazy because we're going to change back to in-person data collection soon. So that might change things. So figuring out kind of what those like expected ranges should be it's like this kind of constant question, and asking a VP doesn't help me because they don't know either. But at least they're feeling like they have something to latch onto and something to start from. So that's been really helpful and useful for us. But yeah, just being able to communicate that it's a little bit messy right now has been helpful too. And having this peer group to be able to say, well, they're all in that same experience. It's a little bit different on where you are, but this is what they're seeing compared to us. That's also helpful for us to have kind of a comparison group. So we're using kind of all of the above that we've been chatting about.
Awesome. Thanks, Lauren. And I'll say that even before COVID hit and upended everything every 3 days or so for you all museums, that sense of taking a year to understand the system and get a sense of the data has been pretty constant. Like even for folks who joined in 2017, 2018, going through it and using it and figuring out what does this information mean for us? How do we bring it into conversations? Usually takes a year to a year and a half for sort of getting settled. So just wanted to share that too. Betsy, I see you came off mute.
Yeah, and I think Lauren, you and your museum and ours joined around the same time. So we are just have kind of hit our number for being able to think, okay, this is, going to be something you can extrapolate. We have had questions in that we're looking at. One that we used, and I saw somebody in the chat did this as well, is we have a question in ours about helpful staff, and that is consistently our highest rated thing, 9 point something or other. And so that is a really wonderful thing to be able to share with staff, because there might be other things that are not going so great. We, beyond COVID kind of happening in our having to have certain parts of the exhibits closed at different points, in August, we had a water main break underneath the museum and flooded 25,000 gallons of water. And so we had to close off the section with our theater and part of our science center. And so we've been definitely hearing about things are closed or things are not in working order. And so we know a reason for some of that, but it still doesn't feel good to people who, for example, exhibit techs or whoever, to see that. So kind of keeping that, yes, there's that information, but we know there's a reason behind it, has been helpful for us. But we're just at that point too, we just created a new strategic plan that went into effect last August. And so we're just starting to try to kind of percolate some of this into the KPIs. So.
I'm wondering, just to kind of follow up my questions, how many of you had a really strong institutional practice of goal setting and KPIs prior to joining COVES? Or was COVES something that motivated that? Because I see, like, if that's already there and you're then augmenting it, well, now we have some COVES data to measure that. Or if you're a little more like us, where let's make up some numbers now for a goal.
Yeah. I think that's a great question. Are folks willing to like maybe even use the reactions button and like check mark if you had a process of creating museum-wide goals? that green check mark or a red X of like, nope, that didn't exist, and maybe it still doesn't. See one X, one thumbs up, more X's. Okay. I like the hands up, Holly. Yay! No. That might even be some of the first like places to start in some of these. I know that we often talk about how do we start the conversations? How do we like get this moving forward, and saying, here's a reflection of the last quarter, or, you know, here's how we closed out the calendar year 21. What would we like to see? Like, this is where we were. What would we like to see? We're trying to create experiences for people. So what do we want? Sorry, go ahead, Holly.
No, I just think the challenge is like, I have hopes and dreams and desires,
Yeah.
but being a very small institution, we don't have a research and evaluation team. And so I don't have the bandwidth to really do. I would like to get us to that place. And I'll say that since being part of COVES and like using COVES data and comments in, you know, our cross-functional team meetings to kind of give folks even just an anecdotal picture of how we're doing has been useful. Moving forward, like our director of business and marketing, who manages all the other statistics, dashboard stuff, like we're going to be doing a quarterly check-in to get, so I could see us getting there. It's just figuring out how to do it and just implement that into workflow. And, you know, it's complicated.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And even at the Museum of Science, we had a goal setting and tracking kind of practice and everything, but it wasn't as unified as it is now, you know, for better or worse with the OKRs, despite how difficult it has been to sort of learn a new system. Like, it is very consistent. It is very transparent and visible. It's like we get hounding emails about updating them like multiple times a quarter. You know, you do it, like you actually do it. And the whole museum is aware of it in a way that I don't think we quite were before. And that was really from the president. I mean, like, the COVES is part of that, but it wasn't, you know, that the system was driven by our new leadership.
It's great to see the sort of slow incorporation that folks are talking about in the chat. The change, you know, shifting things, changing things for this. Betsy, to your point earlier, talking about you have a new strategic plan that sort of began, I think you said last August. Was anything, you know, interesting or different about the conversation for creating that and saying, how are we going to track our progress because of the now existence of, you know, your participation in COVES and having this regular source of information? Oh, I'm sorry, you're muted, sorry.
There we go. That's better. Yeah, there definitely was a recognition going in that we would have COVES, and some of the things that we're focused on are being relevant to our community. So one of the questions we added into our COVES survey is that, you know, they're asking visitors to what extent the experiences were relevant to them. And so then that will feed right back up into our strategic plan. We're also looking at, we did a community and audience engagement museum assessment program before this plan. And so we're also looking at, are we engaging a broader swath of our community? And so that's going to be something we had, I mean, the way we found out about COVES was when we were doing our map, we realized we did not have a lot of demographic information. And so I reached out to somebody at ASTC that we'd worked on with another project and said, hey, do you know anything? And that's how I got directed to COVES. So we have been interested in demographics, and we really have not had a good source for that until now. And so I think that will also definitely play a role in how are we doing with our strategic plan.
Thank you.
sorry, Dan, are you gonna share? Oh, no, no worries. Beth had put in the chat, you'd love to see some of the custom questions to measure OKRs. And for sure, I can like definitely send some over, but also just to plug ahead 2 months in our webinar series, we're in March, we're planning to focus on sort of sharing and learning from each other's institution-specific questions that we've added. So, you know, whether they're used, you know, tied to KPIs or whatever, or if they're measuring specific initiatives or something, you know, we and you all can share some of your custom questions and why you ask them and what you do with them. Just to plug a couple months ahead.
Yeah, so I think we might have shared this, maybe not. I might be dreaming about another email from Alex, but we do have a bit of a calendar laid out as we had discussed at the end of 2021 creating. So next month we are hoping to do a bit of a meet and greet with everyone. There are a lot of names on here that I don't know, and I think new institutions. So we want to do a little sort of reintroducing ourselves to each other and the sort of full community that is COVES here as we start 2022. And then March, we're hoping to sort of unveil our version of like a library of questions that are based on the additional questions that you all at your institutions have created, and have some like breakouts in small groups and just really talk about why do we ask these questions and what are you getting from them? Because we hear about them, like today, we heard about a few, but there are a lot. And so we thought it might be worth it just having everyone share like how they've been helpful as we think about what opportunities might be ahead in 3 months or 6 months when you go to change those specific questions. So.
And also maybe learning about someone else who's asking a similar question that you didn't know about before, that you have another point of comparison for. All right, well, does anyone else have any, you know, last questions, brilliant thoughts about how you've used COVES in KPIs or strategic planning or anything to wisdom to impart? Because I certainly don't have any, you know, great deep insight to end with, but no, actually, thank you so much everyone for joining us. I hope you really found some of those examples to be helpful and useful. And I guess one thing that maybe I would want to put in perspective is something that Marjorie had said and that you had echoed, Sarah, about you don't know right away what is going to be a good goal to look for. So if you start just by looking at the baseline, if you start just by understanding the scope of what you're measuring and what you're starting with, you don't have to jump into setting an aggressive goal before you really know what you're working with. So just patience with the data and understanding is what we always want to talk about. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon, and look for that meeting invite for February and March as well, as we sort of plan these webinars out in advance.
Awesome.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.